Thank you all for coming today. This is a little bit of a interesting setup for us, but we're really excited to have just a super knowledgeable panel in front of you today. So I'll start with one thought, and that is we all operate in a super competitive industry, an industry where change is the norm, and really the only guidepost that we have is data about the industry, data about games, data about players. But ultimately, that data isn't really useful unless there's insight and action that can be taken from it. And so we're lucky enough today to have a really diverse panel coming from not just experts in data, experts from actual game publishing and operations, and also an expert from the investment field. So I'll have them introduce themselves, but for those who ask the best questions, I think one of the panelists might have a check for you at the end of it if you happen to be fundraising. All right, so Joost, maybe you can kick it off.
Sure thing. Thanks everyone for coming out. My name is Joost van Dreunen. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called SuperData. We do a lot of market research on mobile, PC, console games. We do a lot of benchmarking. In addition, I also teach at the business school at NYU in New York, and I'm happy to take any questions today. Nice to meet you.
Hello, I'm Etienne. I'm sales director at Ubisoft Mobile. So we have been doing quite a few games at Ubisoft, the Rayman series, Assassin's Creed, or Trials. Lately, we've been happy enough to be joined by Ketchup, who's also quite successful. Very recently, we just soft launched South Park mobile game, and we're also partnering with Tencent on a major release that just happened last week. Within Ubisoft, I'm doing everything distribution and biz dev related.
I'm Guzman. I work for Index Ventures. We're a global venture capital fund based in Europe and North America. Much like Unity, we have European roots. We started down in Switzerland, but now mostly based out of London. And we have a pretty long history investing in games, back since 2005 when we invested in King, and then we followed on with a few other studios you might have heard of, like Playfish, Supercell, Roblox, etc. Altogether, we've invested in about 22 gaming companies over the last decade, and we continue investing heavily in the space. So if anyone is fundraising later on, I'd love to have a chat.
Awesome, and that's a guarantee, right?
Pretty much.
Great. So the format of the panel today is going to start with data from Unity. And so data that we've collected through Unity Analytics and through the runtime of the engine. So just to give you a sense of scale, we saw about 1.8 billion downloads over the last month. We've seen over 110,000 different games during that time as well, and ultimately about 350,000 unique players. So this gives you access to a sense of the data, and today what we want to do is focus specifically on the European market. Hopefully that's an area of interest to everyone. And also catch on one specific theme, which is really this thought that games are no longer just static experiences, but really live operations that constantly need to just adapt to not only what the content you're putting out, but ultimately the players and how they're interacting with your data, right? So let's dive into it. First thing that we'll look at is specifically the European market and how it's affected Unity. There's no doubt this is one of the most important markets to Unity, and I think to gaming as a whole. We've seen more growth in the number of Unity-built games being downloaded than almost any other market that we cover. So it's important to Unity, and I think maybe from the panelists we can just start with how you look at the European market compared to the overall globe, either from an investment perspective, from a publishing perspective, or even from a research focus perspective. Where does this fall on the ladder of your priorities, and specifically why?
I'll start just to start. So it's an interesting thing. So as a Dutchman living in New York, I look back on the European market as something that's always been a much smaller part of the conversation in traditional interactive and gaming business. So it used to be the case that North America and Asia, or Japan specifically, were at the top. Europe was there, but it wasn't as important for a lot of publishers. With digitalization, with the sort of move towards live operations and the sort of current generation of devices in the games industry, European market has become a lot more interesting, not just because of its addressable market, but also because of its diversity, right? So all of a sudden you see Nordic countries take over in a way that they provide a lot of innovation, a lot of new content that then becomes popular on the worldwide stage. So it's changed the balance of the games industry in a big way, and I think the addressable market in terms of installs and the consumer size, I think that really kind of proves that point, right? It's not just the supply side that's much more diverse and interesting, it's also the consumer side. So that's a really interesting development for us.
Yeah, on my side, on Ubisoft side, sorry, we are obviously European based. Our IP resonates very strongly here. So we're very happy that this market is so strong. I just want to point out that this 57% growth might be faster than the market.
That's fair.
So we are not seeing that much of a growth.
Yep.
And also we are speaking about one single European market, whereas I would say that on the one hand you have the UK, which is already very far in advance in terms of conversion, RPD, whereas mainland Europe is a bit different. And Eastern Europe and Russia is obviously have a slower RPD and conversion.
That's a perfect point. Why don't we click to that? And if you want to speak to any specific regions or the specific data as we've had, let's get into it.
Yeah, obviously here we are missing UK, the UK, which is the biggest market, at least from what we saw. Russia and Turkey are indeed the fastest growing market. I want to speak about what I know best, which is basically the ecosystem in each of the countries. What you have to keep in mind is that the UK, for instance, is mostly iOS-centric, while mainland Europe is more toward Google Play, and Russia is the only market where you can see some exotic stores, whereas on all the other markets it's mostly iOS and Google Play. But it's obviously very easy to address the whole market through the main store on mobile, just by a few clicks.
Yeah. And Guzman, do you think about specific countries and geographies when you're looking at publishers and investing in them? Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say, hopefully that 57% doesn't correlate with the ketchup fidget spinner game that came out. I mean, I think this is a really interesting chart in a way. It correlates directly with the population of every country, right? It's not a surprise that Russia is the biggest country. However, when you put this ranking by revenue, average revenue per paying user, etc., it shifts quite a lot, right? And particularly for us, when we look at target demographics for gaming companies we invest in, US is definitely number one priority, but Europe is coming second if it's a Western developer. And CIS, Russia, Ukraine, other countries in that region for us is kind of a challenge we're trying to figure out how to tackle. Very deep multiplayer gaming community, being there for decades. Super strong communities around games like Counter-Strike on PC. What does that mean for mobile? We see a lot of synchronous multiplayer games coming out on mobile in the last 6 months, and will definitely be more coming out in the next couple of years. And we think we will see a lot more value extracted from users in those regions, 1, 2, 3 years from now, compared to the last 5 years. You guys mentioned one point that I found particularly interesting, and that's around fragmentation, right? So fragmentation of markets is one way to look at it. Our data also is really interesting around fragmentation of devices that you need to support. Etienne, you mentioned Google Play as being, I guess, the driver of fragmentation from a device perspective. Is there any advice you can give people based on some of the data we have here when it comes to market share? Yeah, the first advice, I guess you will be very happy with it, is use Unity Intelligence. Definitely, that's the best tool there is out there. Thank you. In order to just deal with the fragmentation. So from the data we are seeing here, this is a fast renewing market. We have 50% of the top 10 devices that were on there a year ago. Europe is most likely one of the most fragmented markets. If you look at LATAM, for example, or Brazil, you have some of the devices that account for 15, 20, 25%. Here, the top one is 1.6%, so it's extremely difficult to address it.
and yeah, Europe is not specific in that, where Asia or the US are also very fragmented, but obviously it's not a country where you will soft launch, so getting to learn about the market beforehand and using some of the data available, and potentially some from Unity, is a key advice that we can give any publisher.
Awesome. And so we mentioned soft launch, and that's usually by geography, and we look at installs. Another way to look at it is where we're seeing day one retention, right? Even with smaller markets with nice day one retentions, it could be a place to think about soft launching. Here's our data on day one retention. It seems to center around certain geographies, but would love some insight here to share with the panel.
Yeah, it's interesting to see this. We've hardly ever focused on looking at geographies this way. I find, naturally Nordics have been a good way of testing games, and then kind of comparing that population to UK and US, given the average purchasing power of the population. I think it's hard to extract any meaningful conclusions from such high level data. I mean, it's really title by title, right? If a game is not particularly engaging and doesn't generally have a good average day one retention, putting it on a different country won't solve that, right? I think it comes down to game design at the end of the day.
Yeah, one thing I want to bump on what you are saying, the one thing we can notice is that there is no difference. And the no difference might come from the fact it is pretty consistent market fragmentation-wise. There was an announcement from Google at I.O. that games that are faulty, have bugs, have a 30% less day one retention. Here we don't see any of the country that really falls behind. So what we can assume is that from these top 10 countries, they have a pretty consistent high-end or mid-end device market. And this obviously helps the best developers to really address in the proper way. So no big discrepancies. That's what I would assess from this chart.
I think pairing this with the last chart, right, which, as you said, most of these countries have higher-end devices. One thing we do look at is, do the games these developers put out run consistently at 60 frames per second in the devices they play them on, right? And so naturally, countries with lower-end devices will struggle to keep up with high-quality content or less optimized content, thereby affecting their retention, not necessarily because of a design problem, but because of a performance one.
So speaking of performance, often driven by the components at the device level rather than the devices themselves, right? So retention as an output of FPS, stuttering, things like that. Our data shows that the top performing GPUs are 2x probably the lower and mid-end ones. CPUs a much larger discrepancy, and this is for Android only, right? So when it comes to testing, when it comes to making sure that you have coverage at the component level, is this something that you guys think about, especially at Ubisoft, and how do we just go out and buy a whole bunch of devices and hope we cover all this? Or what is the best practice, and how could a smaller publisher actually use this information?
I will point to Unity Intelligence again. I don't know if it was the point. But yeah, we try and create a subset of the market, the Android market. There is about 16K device out there available on the Play console. So we try to do like few hundred stop in order to really assess the market. And we test our games against those devices, and it gives us a good glimpse of what we can achieve and what we could afford without spending too much time. I just want to point out from this chart the top 5 CPU. Obviously, x86 is a more challenging platform, and you can see that the day one retention is way lower, and that kind of echoed on the fact that faulty and buggy games have a huge impact on day one retention.
Can I chime in?
Of course.
So, here's the thing: if you recall, before the smartphone, the mobile games market was tremendously fragmented, right? So you had to go to a telecom operator and you had to make the same game 400 times for all of the handsets that would come out under AT&T or Vodafone that year. So it's very valuable to understand the differentiating factors, the sort of design parameters in which you are. But I would contest an earlier comment saying, it doesn't only has to be 60 frames per second. Much of the games industry, especially the mobile games industry, from what we see, is a very casual market. A lot of what the titles or the genres that are popular on those platforms are, they appeal to audiences that don't really care about 60 frames per second. And so you can figure out by looking at this type of data, in my mind, finding those pockets of consumers that match the games that you're designing. So it's really about teeing those things up. You have to. It's not just in the traditional sense with the console business where it has to be the best and the fastest. It can really just be a specific targeted audience or a specific targeted genre. And that type of fragmentation, you didn't used to have this. So I think that's a very valuable piece from this.
So staying with you, Joost, I think one trend that you've often identified and looked into with your data is around the freshness or the updates or the games as a service concept, right? So this is some data that we pulled around the number of updates a mobile game has versus their day one retention, and how keeping the game fresh is such a new concept when it comes to consoles. Is there something that you can help developers understand when it comes to that sort of concept?
There's a few things. So I would start here saying, so traditionally as a creative business, and that applies to game development as well as any other kind of creative industry, the tendency tends to be to say, well, we're going to build the best thing ever, and then we're going to launch it, and then the sun and the moon will align, and we'll all be millionaires. It's most of the time it's not so, right? It's a much more gradual process. What the switch to games as a service or the digitalization behind it affords you is this ability to kind of slowly and gradually build up your user base. And so you can do a staggered or tiered release, you can kind of test things, but you can also do content drops over time. What that allows you to do, and that kind of depends on where you are as a company, of course, but if you really want to make a fun game and do this for the long term, you end up having to deal with things like rent and a lot of capital questions, right? And so what a games as a service model affords you is to basically mitigate your financial risk, and that's what you see with these releases over time, right? So I can see now in market X that my retention is a little lower than I want it to be, so let me fix that first before I go into this other bigger market, and so that I don't lose or sort of have customers turn away from me right away. So there's a lot of benefits to kind of hold off on the enthusiasm and not want to launch everything at once and sort of gradually enter the market. And that's what we see with the games as a service as one of the big identifying characteristics.
And obviously, if this is what you observe from hopefully people who use Unity Analytics, right,
Yes.
is that the more A/B testing you run, the better you understand how your players behave with the game, the more you can, tweak and optimize the funnel such as to improve this day one retention, right? I mean, the difference between update, if you're going to go to the axis below 20 and update 1, I don't know which time frame this is, but it probably involves a whole lot of learnings over many users that you can see clearly incorporated in the final product affecting the retention.
Yes. So retention, often a proxy for success. Financial success could be one way to look at it. We've done something that's a little interesting, and there could be some insights into this, which is really combining our ads data around the cost per install and the revenue that we see from certain geographies, right? So not clear if there's a specific insight from this, but I know someone like Etienne might be doing a lot of acquisition, and if there's some insight that we can help the audience with, we'd love to share it at this point.
The people with money spend money.
Yeah, and small market are untapped. I'm not sure we should design any games out of this. Obviously, Switzerland and Luxembourg are very small niche markets, and they're also countries where people speak a lot of language, 3 languages in Switzerland. Luxembourg is not such a popular language. So I'm not sure about this graph. Obviously, the biggest markets are well established here. There might be some short-term potential for Switzerland and Luxembourg, but one way to look at it is really the sheer volume you can achieve in these countries and the issue with the localization.
Is there this concept, I know in North America, where we often use Canada or Australia for soft launches, right? Is there that same concept using these smaller countries for testing where you could get maybe a more efficient test versus trying to get scale right off the bat?
We don't, because what we want is to have something that's as representative at the market as possible. So we've done, I mentioned South Park. South Park is live in Nordics, partly because the market, because the studio is based there, partly because we know well the market also. We tend to do Canada a lot. Canada is quite good to represent the market.
So I'll jump in real quick and say what I like about this slide, even though it doesn't allow us to really set in the design agenda, is, it's part of a larger conversation where we can't just, abandon this idea that marketing doesn't matter, right? For the longest time, traditional game publishing has always been 50-50 split between marketing and development budget. A big game like Grand Theft Auto costs 260 million, half of that goes towards marketing. I'm sure the same applies to Ubisoft's main titles. And that's a model that makes it particularly expensive to build something like that, which is why we have, on the legacy side, so few publishers now. Mobile, for the longest time, had this mythology of, well, I'll just publish something and then Apple's going to make me rich and send me checks in the mail. That notion, while that may have existed in 2008, right, as we come up on the 10th anniversary of the iPhone, it's very exciting, but that's over now too, right? And so having, even just as a designer or a developer, a rudimentary understanding that there is such a thing as, user acquisition cost, will fundamentally sort of inform how you develop your game. And I think that that's a very sort of healthy development. We got to professionalize this. When I talk to the students at NYU, a lot of them sit there with big eyes saying, I'm going to make this amazing game, and sort of forget about the fact that that's a business as well. You have to be, if you want to go to the Olympics, then you have to sort of take your jog around the park and rationalize that process. So this is, for me, a good step in that process.
Building on that, I think one thing that we're not suggesting here is that you pick what you develop based on the monetary potential. But I think for financial modeling and making sure that you can build a business in terms of if that's your intent, here's our data when it comes to the per monthly active user revenue. So we throw casino up there because it's interesting, but really potentially not part of this core discussion that we have here. So maybe drilling in on what we traditionally think of as the gaming space. Is there any insight that we can take from this when it comes to what is monetization potential and how that affects your potential operation of the game and how and where you invest when it comes to operating your game?
I could talk about this for hours, so I won't do that. But it's, I think it's good to know where you stand in the world, right? I mean, there's a realization of, say, okay, well, if we're making a sports game, that means that we have to rely on licenses. Maybe we want to get a FIFA license or something along those lines. Those things all cost money. In setting up a business plan, whether you present that to a publisher or an investor down the line, you want to have that sort of budgetary, that P&L statement sort of straight in your mind. What I would love to see based on this type of data is, when we talk about games as a service, is what's the lifetime value of a customer? If somebody spends $19 on a sports game once or $12 on a puzzle game one time, that's cool, but do they stay with me for 6 months? And then, how long and how frequently do they make purchases? And so that is a much more interesting metric in that context. But comparing it, it's very clear that there is a steep power curve in terms of what people are willing to spend on a monthly basis.
I think the interesting takeaway as well is if you look at like the top 5 categories versus the bottom 5, is that the top 5 typically tend to be inherently more social in nature, right? And so in a way, what we find, and I'm sure you guys see as well, is where there is a social loop, something that generates retention beyond the core gameplay. The fact that you're either in a clan or a guild or some form of group of people where you're more vested, you tend to have longer lifetime as a user, and thereby typically spending more money because of the commitment to this group of people. I'm frankly surprised card is so low. Is that card as in, would we consider things like Hearthstone only here, or is it card just like Solitaire would count as well?
Yes, anything to do with cards. So
Okay,
it includes,
okay.
it expands beyond just card role-playing games.
Right. Got it.
Cool. So let's spend the rest of our time that we have talking about the future, talking about trends. And one of the one of the charts that I love the most in this deck actually doesn't come from Unity, it comes from Joost. But I would love to spend a little bit of time of looking at the trends, and we talk about this games as a service as where dollars are being spent and people are being focused, really looking at how starkly this next chart kind of calls it out. So maybe not talk for hours on it, but yes, I would love to have you kind of walk through it. And
we have until 2, right? So I'll give you the punchline of this graph in under a minute. So traditionally, the games industry has been sold in a box through retail. So you have to go to the store, you get a disc, you stick it in a computer somewhere or a console, and that was, for all intents and purposes, a product-based model. Over the last years then, this has been changing to a digital model where now we download things directly, we have microtransactions, we have live operations, we have a service-based model, allowing you to, as a developer and a publisher, to take a fundamentally different route, right? It allows for different capital risk mitigation when it comes to your capital structure, but it also allows you to do very different games from a design perspective. So as a result of all that, that's of course cool and that's fun. As a result, gaming has become much more of a mainstream form of entertainment, right? So in my part of the world, I've been arguing that, next to movies and music and books, video games have been something that a lot of people play and that is a valuable market in and of its own right. So all of a sudden, over the last 10 years, gaming has become this mainstream form of entertainment, and that has allowed a much larger audience, but also a much more diverse audience to enter the conversation. And so suddenly now you see something happening that's new, and that's the last piece of it here called media. The media component is, every other entertainment form makes money off of advertising. And it's always been that way, and consumers are totally fine with that. But it's never been possible in the games industry. So the new sort of innovation as a result of this popularization of gaming has become where you see esports, or you see Facebook going after gaming video content. You can build ads into your model. Those are all things that allow you to now have 3 different revenue streams, further mitigate your capital structure and the risk associated with it, but also come up with an even newer generation of games and games designs. So that's sort of the punchline here. Money, in my mind, or business practices inform aesthetic principles, and so by sort of following the money, you open yourself up to a broader range of opportunities. That was it. That was the 2-minute version of a 2-hour lecture.
As it relates to building sustainable business, a piece of data I'd love to know is sort of when you think about traditional business, legacy business, where kind of like the product bottom part of it, the entirety or almost the entirety of those $30 billion, except back catalog, churns every year and gets replaced by new content every year, right? But on the service side, a portion of that, and I don't know which portion that would be, but it is recurrent from the same bucket last year and the year before, right? If you look at the top grossing charts, Clash of Clans, Game of War, Candy Crush have been there for 3-4 years already. It'd be interesting to know which part of the 94 was there the year before, right? And I don't know if this is something easy to share or not, but
it's not easy to share, but I can tell you. So of course, in the product-based business, as every other entertainment industry, we see serialization or sequels, right? So it's the same game over and over again, with some expansions to it. So Grand Theft Auto is probably a good example here. You see some of the product in terms of the hardware sales. It's done really well since 2013, makes $1 billion at retail in 3 days. That's great. It makes another $1.5 billion in service over time. So that's the same game year over year. That's on the console side and the PC, of course, on that high end. For mobile, that's very similar to where a Clash of Clans and so on, they continue to make money over time.
I think that the difference is, though, as you say, like every year there's, say, a new Call of Duty, right, with a new Call of Duty type marketing budget. However, a mobile install that doesn't churn stays, right? So from year 1 to year 2, you don't have to have the same user acquisition cost again. Mm-hmm. While on console, you might argue, certainly there is some goodwill to the franchise value that gets people to buy it regardless of whether they saw advertising or not. But typically what I see is marketing budgets for those games tend to be higher.
Yes, of course. And so the traditional Call of Duties, they sell themselves really well because they are familiar, the franchises obviously. I think with, it's hard to compare because what pushes a lot of software is of course new hardware releases. And so the challenge in putting this on a one-to-one model is that in the current 8th generation of consoles, we have this sort of halfway stop with the PlayStation Pro and then the Xbox One X. So it's a much more confused market than it used to be, but traditionally it used to be, here's a new device and then a whole bunch of games comes out. We see that on an annual basis when people get their new iPhone for Christmas, that's when you see more spending in those months. So then naturally the marketing budgets follow those trends in those sort of months of the year, which makes them higher as well. So the formulas are not as simple as they used to be. You're right about that.
Cool. So I do want to get to questions, but no discussion of the future, I think, wouldn't touch on AR, VR, right? So let's just fly through some of this data right here, which once again, we go back to Unity's data on, it's probably some of the best in the industry on where the adoption is happening, right? I would juxtapose this in terms of adoption with where people are continuously engaging with VR. So I know this is not a core market for any of us yet today, but how are we thinking about VR, and specifically, what are the types of content and things like that that we're kind of thinking and working about?
Yeah, I just take that just to point out something that might be obvious to some of you. Out of these charts, only Germany has Daydream. Right. And Daydream is the fourth VR platform. It's not available in France, Russia, Turkey, or any other country. And you can see both the fact that the volumes of install and the sticky factor is impacted by the fact that you have a major mobile VR platform available in Germany. So it's difficult to compare. It would have been interesting to have like US or the UK. We are seeing some success in Daydream.
Yeah. So let's also, talking about Daydream, one interesting trend that we've seen in our data is the conversion of session times when it comes to PC and mobile, right? Counterintuitive, but this is a trend that we've seen really kind of coalesce in the last year. When we look at VR and building those experiences, there's a wide gap between what we're seeing possible on PC and console versus what's on mobile, right? And that might speak to the maturity of the content, it might speak to what people are focused on in each of these platforms, but where do you guys see it going when it comes to AR, VR? What are the specific platforms that you might want to focus on if you have a certain objective, be it retention versus just number of installs?
So I'll tackle the graph on the left first. I think the current state of VR is still such where, as a consumer, like I'm going to take the afternoon off and set it all up and play for a while, right? So the barriers to entry from just like picking it up and playing it are still relatively high. For a mobile, it's much lower. So that would be consistent. Like once I'm invested, I'm going to stick around and play for a little bit longer. Arguably, of course, mobile also tends to be, and I have to ask, so does VR here include also AR, like a game like Pokemon?
Yes.
So that would be consistent for me then as well, saying like, look, I'll just whip out my phone and catch a few Pokemon, right? So there's that.
That's fair.
So from a usage perspective, this is all pretty consistent. It's spending, I would argue. I don't know if the equation is the same, right? So usually the equation is more time spent is more money spent. I don't know if that would apply here equally.
Fair point. We're getting pulled off the stage here, so want to first thank the panelists. Incredible insight and really appreciate it. Maybe the panelists can spend a couple minutes in the back. If you have specific questions, if you want to get a check for your fundraising, please come and see us, and we'll take the conversation off stage for now. Thank you guys once again.
Thank you.
Thanks.